I'm Veronica Hale, a marriage and family therapist, and your companion here on Love and Lies TV. Today, I want to tell you a story that began with one sentence. A sentence Graham, the man sitting across from me, spoke during our very first session. Veronica, I thought my life was peaceful. Turns out, I was just asleep. Graham and his wife, Elna Walker, had been together for 16 years. A marriage that, on the surface, had absolutely no reason to raise suspicion. They lived in a beautiful home in the suburbs, where the mornings were full of sunlight and the evenings were so quiet, you'd swear their life could only be described as happy. Both earned good money, very good money. They had elegant dinners, twice yearly vacations, photos full of bright smiles in front of blue oceans, and glittering company events. Everything told the same story. They were fine, better than fine. They didn't have children together, but Graham had an adult son from a previous marriage. And Elena, she carried herself with such grace and maturity that there was never a moment she seemed jealous or resentful. Graham once told me, with a sincerity that stayed with me, Elena made me believe we had already outgrown the storms of youth, that this was the peaceful life a 52-year-old man like me deserved. But in life, the marriages that look the most stable are sometimes the ones with the deepest, quietest cracks. Because peace, when it isn't nourished by truth and connection, is nothing more than a thin mist. Beautiful, but easily blown apart. And Graham had no idea that behind that mist, a truth was waiting for him, a truth that would change everything. And then the day came, the day his peace shattered into pieces so small he could barely hold them. Graham told me it started as a perfectly ordinary afternoon. He was cleaning Elena's car, something he did every few months, part affection, part a small surprise to make her smile. He said, "I thought I was doing something kind. I didn't know I was about to open a completely different door in my life." Under the passenger seat, he found a small leather notebook, expensive, still smelling new. At first, he assumed it was Elena's work planner. She had a high-level job, stayed busy, and often took notes. But when Graham opened it, something inside him froze. The neat handwriting, unmistakably hers. But the words, not work lists, not event schedules. No, it was the journal of a secret relationship. Elena had been having an affair for almost 2 years, with a 41-year-old man named Colin Mercer. But what truly sent a chill down Graham's spine wasn't the affair itself. He told me, his voice tight, almost breaking, "Veronica, if it were just misplaced feelings, maybe I could have tried to understand. But what I read, it wasn't love. It was strategy." In the journal, Elena didn't write about emotions, guilt, or inner conflict. She wrote like someone drafting a business plan. When to file for divorce, how to prove Graham was distant and emotionally cold, what narrative to give her attorney to gain leverage, and most importantly, how to split assets to ensure she got the most. One line nearly made Graham drop the notebook. "Graham suspects nothing. I just need to keep everything stable for another 12-18 months, and I'll be free, financially and emotionally." Elena had even created contingency scripts. If Graham asked questions, act hurt, accuse him of being inattentive. If Graham seemed suspicious, blame work stress. If Graham discovered Colin, call him a platonic emotional friend. Graham whispered to me, "I felt my heart fall to the floor. She didn't just betray me, she was engineering me." And in that moment, a 52-year-old man who believed he was living in a safe, steady marriage finally understood. Peace is sometimes only what you see on the surface. The truth lived inside a small notebook forgotten under a car seat. What made me respect Graham wasn't his calmness. It was the way a man with a shattered heart still managed to think with his head instead of his wounds. He didn't explode. He didn't throw the journal in Elena's face. He didn't confront her, didn't beg, didn't ask why. He told me, "Veronica, if I confronted her while my emotions were on fire, I'd lose everything. She had a 2-year plan. I had one chance to protect myself." And so, in silence, Graham began to strike back. He hired a shark attorney, not a family friend, not a let's keep this civil type, but one of those high-stakes divorce lawyers whose reputation alone makes the other side flinch. When Graham handed him the copied pages from Elena's journal, the attorney said only one thing: "You have no idea what kind of weapon you're holding." He hired a private investigator, not to catch Elena in the act. He already had more than enough evidence from the journal. The investigator's job was to verify every detail Elena had written, track Colin Mercer, document every meeting between Elena and Colin, build a complete airtight timeline of the affair. Graham told me I needed truth, not emotion. Then he hired a forensic accountant, and that's when the second shock hit. Tiny transfers, small amounts, spread out over more than a year. Total, $49,000. Elena had been quietly funneling money into a private account, the exact escape fund she referenced in her plan to leave him. When Graham heard the final number, he didn't yell. He didn't curse. He just exhaled and said, "She didn't just want to leave. She wanted to cut me out of my own life." He photographed every single page of the journal. Not a line skipped, not a detail overlooked. The meeting places, the times, the fabricated stories, the cold, calculated notes about Graham's assets. It wasn't a journal anymore. It was a self-written indictment. A document Elena herself had crafted to destroy her own marriage. And then he built the file: adultery plus financial misconduct. The file was so thick the attorney had to break it into sections. Graham spent 5 weeks preparing, 5 weeks of silence, 5 weeks of eating dinner with Elena, listening to her talk about work, letting her touch his hand, while knowing this woman was mapping out the steps to drain the life he had built. He told me, "She spent 2 years preparing to ruin me. I spent 5 weeks preparing to stop her and save myself." And this was only the beginning. When Graham reached this part of the story, he leaned back in his chair, eyes unfocused, as if he could still hear the sound of his own heart cracking all over again. Because his next step wasn't born from rage. It came from something colder, deeper. If I stay silent, they'll do this to someone else. So Graham contacted Rachel Mercer, Colin's wife. Rachel worked in HR at the same corporation where both Colin and Elena were employed. Principled, calm, completely unaware she'd been betrayed for nearly 2 years. Graham called her on a Friday afternoon. He spoke slowly, gently. "Rachel, I think there's something you need to know." When Rachel arrived at his home, Graham didn't start with accusations. He brought out the journal and a thick folder, every piece of evidence he had gathered. He slid the files gently toward Rachel and whispered, "I'm sorry, but this truth shouldn't stay buried." Rachel opened the pages one by one, and her hands started to tremble. Detailed notes about every meeting, the fabricated excuses, the strategies Elena planned to use, the way she wrote about Colin, not as a lover, but as a tool in her financial game. Then came the photos taken by the private investigator, the receipts, the messages. At some point, Rachel began to cry, but it wasn't the cry of someone collapsing. It was the cry of a woman realizing she had trusted the wrong person for far too long. She closed the folder, lifted her head, looked straight at Graham, and said a sentence that gave me chills when Graham told it. "Thank you. The truth may kill me today, but it will save me for the rest of my life." The very next day, Rachel did exactly what a principled woman would do. She filed a formal internal complaint with the upper-level HR division, not the department she oversaw, to avoid a conflict of interest. In her report, she detailed the secret relationship between Elena and Colin, a clear violation of company ethics and policy. No intimate relationships between employees on the same project. No using work as a cover for personal affairs. No behavior that harms corporate integrity through deception. When Graham reached this part, he said, "I didn't destroy anyone. I simply allowed the truth to walk into the light." And from that moment, the dominoes began to fall. And then, we arrive at the part many people call cruel. But to me, it was simply balance returning to where it belonged. When the file Graham submitted to the court was opened, no one in that courtroom could remain neutral, because what he brought wasn't a handful of loose pieces. It was a fully mapped out blueprint of a betrayal built with intention. Elena's entire journal, authenticated by a handwriting expert, financial discrepancies, private investigator surveillance, HR documentation from the internal complaint, and most damning of all, the line Elena wrote in her own hand: "Another 18 months, and I'll be free." The court didn't just see an affair. The court saw fraud, deception, and a clear intent to seize assets. When the judgment was announced, Elena stood frozen, as if someone had just pulled every ounce of air out of the room. She was ordered to return all $49,000 she had secretly funneled into her private account. And in the division of assets, where she would normally receive half under the law, the judge awarded her around 15%. No spousal support, no additional claims, no special favors. The home they lived in for 16 years, awarded entirely to Graham. Elena's career, after being fired and blacklisted in her industry, effectively ended that very day. Meanwhile, Graham walked out of the courthouse with nearly everything he had worked for, and a strange, quiet calm. Not because he was happy Elena had lost so much, but because he knew, if I hadn't protected myself, she would have done exactly what she wrote in that journal. When Graham told me this, he smiled, a sad, tired smile. "I didn't win. I just refused to lose in the way she planned for me to." And that is the essence of this divorce. Asymmetrical, but absolutely deserved. And then, something happened that Graham never expected. Something that came even faster than the divorce ruling, the judgment of the public. His story, though he never intended to share it, somehow leaked onto social media. One anonymous post, a short summary, a blurry photo of a journal page. And that was all it took for the internet to do what the internet always does: split the world into two opposing sides. On one side were the people who had been hurt before, the ones who had loved the wrong person, the ones who knew betrayal firsthand. They wrote, "Graham was smart. There's nothing cruel about this. He protected himself. Without evidence, she would have taken half his assets." They saw a man who refused to be the victim of a plan that took 2 years to build. But on the other side, the side where emotion outweighs logic, the accusations came like stones. He destroyed his wife's career. Why not divorce quietly? This was revenge. What kind of man is that cruel? Some even sent threats. Someone published his home address. Others emailed his workplace, calling him a controlling man who ruins women's lives. And in the middle of all that noise, Graham, in the same calm way he handles everything, said only one sentence. "She spent 2 years preparing to destroy my life. I spent 5 weeks stopping that plan before it happened." No anger, no excuses, no dramatic speech. Just a simple truth, cold as steel. People can debate morality, intentions, fairness, cruelty. But there's one thing no one can deny. If Graham hadn't acted, the person being crushed today would have been him, not Elena. And sometimes, in love, in marriage, in betrayal, the only difference between the villain and the survivor is simply who moves first. But to understand this story fully, we need to look deeper into the psychology of Elena Walker, the woman behind every page of that journal. And I need to say this plainly, because I've seen this pattern many times in therapy. Elena didn't cheat because of love. She cheated because of emptiness. When Graham finished reading the journal, what suffocated him wasn't the parts where Elena wrote about Colin Mercer. Those entries were strangely cold. There wasn't a single line about affection, attachment, or hope. Colin didn't show up in her journal as a person. He appeared as a function, a dopamine hit, an escape from boredom, a reminder that she's still desirable. Elena wrote, "Colin is new enough to make me feel attractive, but not someone I'd ever build a future with." One sentence, but it reveals an entire mindset. This wasn't cheating for love. This was cheating for ego. And do you know what the most painful part is? Not that she used Colin as a kind of emotional toy, but that she used her own husband as a long-term financial strategy. In multiple entries, Elna referred to Graham with words no loving wife would ever use: financial safety net, stable economic base, last gold mine before freedom. When I read those lines, I exhaled slowly. This is the type of betrayal psychologists call structural betrayal. Not impulsive, not emotional, but deliberately engineered over time. Elena believed Graham was too trusting to notice. She believed 16 years of marriage would blind him. She believed a gentle, selfless man like Graham would never check, never question, never fight back. I've read many journals in the therapy room, but rarely have I seen one that made things so clear. Elna didn't love Colin. She didn't respect Graham. She only loved the future she thought she could extract from him, and it was that arrogant belief, Graham will never find out, that ultimately brought her entire plan crashing down. And then, after all the facts, the evidence, every line in that journal, Graham Walker said something to me that I still remember clearly. It wasn't the sentence of an angry man. It was the truth spoken by someone who had walked through a storm and come out the other side seeing human nature for what it really is. He said, "What hurt me the most wasn't the affair. It was knowing she was planning to destroy me, while still kissing me goodnight." When Graham said that, his voice didn't shake. There was no rage, just exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that comes from looking back at your entire life and asking yourself, how many years did I sleep next to someone who had stopped being mine long before I realized it? He wasn't devastated because Elena loved someone else. People change, people drift, people make mistakes. He was devastated because Elena used his trust as raw material for her strategy. Day after day, she built the image of a caring wife, cooking dinner, sending goodnight texts, asking about his day. While in her journal, she wrote step-by-step instructions on how to leave him in the most profitable way. Graham told me, "It wasn't the betrayal in the bedroom that broke me. It was the betrayal at the dinner table, in every goodnight kiss, in every pretend hug." I looked at him and understood. This was the kind of wound people spend years in therapy trying to gather the pieces of. But then, he said something else. Something I believe many people need to hear. "I didn't act out of cruelty. I simply refused to be the victim." It wasn't an excuse. It was the realization of a man who finally understood that when someone is quietly planning to destroy you, your silence is no longer kindness. It becomes cooperation with your own suffering. And that was the moment Graham stepped out of the role of the gentle, easygoing husband and became a man who protected himself, not with anger, but with clarity. And now, we arrive at the final chapter of this story, a chapter without noise, without fireworks, without dramatic confrontations, just the truth of what remains after an emotional earthquake. 2 years passed. Graham told me that his life now is quiet, a grown, steady kind of quiet, not because everything is perfect, but because he finally stopped fighting for things that were never his to hold on to. He focused on his work, expanded 2 new projects, and spent more time with his adult son, something he hadn't realized he'd slowly lost over the past 16 years. He said, "I don't know if I'm happier now, but I'm free." And sometimes freedom is happiness. And Elena? She lives with her sister in a small town, working a job that pays about a third of what she once earned. Her reputation in the events industry is essentially done. She tried applying elsewhere, but the past always seemed to arrive before she did. Not because anyone sabotaged her, but because her own choices left a trail. And Colin, the man Elena once called her escape, remarried just 11 months after everything fell apart. His life moved on as if nothing had happened. But that's the lesson. The one who causes the hurt isn't always the one who hurts first. As for Rachel, she's the only one who walked away from the wreckage with her feet planted firmly on the ground. A promotion, a peaceful home, a life filled with dignity instead of deception. And Graham, after all of it, looked at me and said, "If I had to choose again, I'd still do the same thing. I'm not a hero, but I sure as hell didn't choose to be a victim." This is the story of a man who learned how to set boundaries, learned when to walk away, and learned never to let someone else decide his worth. If you're still watching at this point, I want to hear what you think. Do you stand with Graham, or do you feel he went too far? Tell me in the comments below. And if this story spoke to you in any way, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so we can keep meeting here every day on Love and Lies TV. I'll see you in the next episode.